One, I think we will start, and folks are still coming on, but we want to give everybody as much time as possible to hear from Cordelia and to engage in conversation afterwards with her. I want to welcome everybody tonight to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia's Winter Speaker Series. We are almost out of winter, so we are our final month of that, and then we'll begin our Spring Speaker Series. I'm Beth Hessel, the Executive Director of the Athenaeum. On the screen, you see myself, you see Tess Galen, our Events Coordinator, who enables you all to get online tonight and to find out about the event, and our speaker, Cordelia Biddle. It's such a pleasure to have all of you here. As you know, if you are a member, the Athenaeum has for a long time been a central place to come for learning and engagement and deeper understanding of not only the world, but Philadelphia in particular, our history, our art, our architecture, our literature, to engage in wonderful conversation with one another as we learn together and grow together and create a bigger, stronger community in Philadelphia. We welcome you. If you are new and this is your first time experiencing us, we invite you to engage even further and look into becoming a member. And I'd be happy to speak with you at any time, as would Tess. If you want to email us or call us after the program, we'd be happy to speak with you about ways of becoming part of this community. Now, as we get onto Zoom, some people are better experienced with Zoom than others, and so it can be a little confusing. If you are on a computer or laptop, you will see up in your upper right-hand corner a little icon that says speaker view or gallery view. If you want speaker view, it will let you see just the person who's speaking. So when Cordelia starts her talk, you might want to switch the view so that you're looking at her and don't have to look at Tess and I while she speaks. Down at the bottom of your screen, you will see a couple of icons, the Q&A and the chat. The Q&A is where you can put any questions that you have during this talk and during the Q&A time that we will use. I'll moderate during the Q&A time, so please put them there. It's a little harder for me to follow in the chat, but if you type them in the chat, I'll try to find your questions too. For those of you who wonder, this is webinar style. If you are have a noisy dog in the background or are eating your roast beef, we cannot see you. So go for it. That's fine. For your hairs and curlers, we can't see you. We just want you here. We're glad you're here and are glad to enjoy this evening with you. This is one of those special evenings when we get not only a wonderful conversation from an esteemed speaker, but from an esteemed speaker who is a longtime shareholder of the Athenaeum. Cordelia Biddle, as many of us know, is not only a member of the Athenaeum who traces her roots back through all of these Biddles, but also is an esteemed member of the Philadelphia community. She's an independent historian and author with a deep passion for history. She has written both fiction and nonfiction. Her most current, of course, that we're going to talk about is this new book, which is getting rave reviews. She has also written a book about Catherine Drexel, St. Catherine, the life of Catherine Drexel. And we're just talking about how wonderful it was that she was able to write that because the archives are currently being destroyed. So she got in there just in time. A good number of fiction books, and she's also contributed to the history of St. Peter's Church and a one-man show, This Community of Faith, Hopes, Dreams, Trials, and Resolutions, which was performed by Sam Waterston in celebration of the 250th anniversary of St. Peter's Church. She's a journalist who has published widely, written 12 mystery novels with her husband, Steve Zettler. And prior to all of this, you may have seen her as an actress on One Life to Live, among other stage and television shows. Cordelia also teaches creative writing at Drexel University's Pennoni Honors College, and she has won many awards for her teaching and her writing. I just wanted to give you one little blurb before we start about her book. Stephen Ujafisa, who has been a literary award winner at the Athenaeum and a member of the Athenaeum, notes that Cordelia Biddle, in this book that we're going to hear about tonight, weaves together a rich and vivid tale of one of America's most prominent, brilliant, and misunderstood figures. And New York Times bestselling author Jonathan Spoto said, "This is history at its best. Perceptive, witty, elegantly composed, and deeply empathetic. I learned a great deal," he said, "from this richly entertaining volume. In fact, I could not put it down." So I think that's enough for us to hear from me, and I will turn it now over to Cordelia to entertain and enliven and teach us about Biddle, Jackson, and a Nation in Turmoil. Join me in welcoming Cordelia Biddle tonight.
Thank you very, very much, Beth. And I'm delighted to be sort of with all of you. I wish it were a little different than this, but it's still going to be wonderful to be together. And I am also delighted that the Athenaeum is able to, via Zoom, reach out to so many more people and spread all this wealth of knowledge and joy and erudition throughout the country. It's very exciting. Nicholas Biddle would be really proud of this, and he was one of the founders. So I think it's fabulous. Let me just begin by saying that in my book, Biddle, Jackson, and Nation in Turmoil, I focus on Nicholas Biddle. He obviously lost an epic battle with Andrew Jackson, and history tends to reward the victors, but Biddle's courage, as well as his hubris, deserves its own story. I also examine Andrew Jackson's popularity with an eye to the historic eras that produced him. As president, as you know, he was a war hero who appealed to a constituency that had previously felt marginalized. They were mostly rural or less educated city dwellers. His popularity came at a cost to the nation, however. The divide between classes, between states, between slave owners and abolitionists grew. As Thomas Jefferson told Daniel Webster in 1824, and I quote, "I feel very much alarmed at the prospect of seeing General Jackson become president. He is one of the most unfit men I know of for such a place. He has very little respect for laws or constitutions. His passions are terrible. When I was president of the Senate and he a senator, he could never speak on account of the rashness of his feelings. His passions are no doubt cooler now. He has been much tried since I knew him, but he is a dangerous man," end quote. However, it was that very sense of menace that appealed to Jackson's adherents. During the election of 1828, Jackson's supporters physically attacked voters casting ballots for then President John Quincy Adams. The newspapers, which I read in their physical form at the Library Company of Philadelphia, provide an absolutely horrifying overview of an America nearly torn asunder by partisan politics. And here is King Andrew I, born to command, holding the veto power in his hand. I'll come back to that a little bit later. So there is one of our protagonists. And the next is a mature Nicholas Biddle. Fascinating characters to examine, both of them. When President Andrew Jackson vowed to kill the central bank the central bank rather than second bank, in 1832, he set in motion the divisive bank war that culminated in 1837 and almost bankrupted the nation. Jackson and his supporters mistrusted central banking, thus they hated the second bank. They believed it benefited only the wealthy, and because they were states' rights proponents, they believed banking should be local rather than a national institution. As early as 1810, the Pennsylvania legislature had argued against the recharter of Alexander Hamilton's First Bank of the United States, which was due to expire in 1811. Nicholas Biddle was then a 25-year-old neophyte legislator. He argued passionately and for 3 hours, solid hours, speaking only from a handful of notes, that a central bank was a national necessity. The start of his speech was deceptively simplistic. He was the young man who obviously considered himself the smartest person in the room. I will quote, "You are to raise an army. You must therefore pay money over the whole frontier of the United States. You are to raise a navy, and you must pay at the remotest parts of the Atlantic or the lakes. If you mean to pay national debts with paper, it must be a national paper. The institution from which it issues must be stamped with something like a national character," end quote. As he wound up for the punch, his eloquence and his ire increased. He believed that economic devastation was a certainty without a national bank. Quote, "In this situation, without credit or money, while your commerce is stopped and your manufacturers languish, do you think its effect will be confined to the city? In the sweeping ruin which will overwhelm humble and useful industry, in the general submersion of small traders, the only beings who will be seen floating on the wreck are those very moneyed aristocrats whom the resolutions denounce with such indignation," end quote. Biddle lost the argument. Then, as now, the Pennsylvania politics are deeply partisan, divided between rural and city. The Pennsylvania legislature and subsequently the national legislature allowed Alexander Hamilton's first bank of the United States to expire, with the result that money to fund the War of 1812 was scarce, and a financial depression ensued, which necessitated a new national bank, the Second Bank of the United States, which was chartered in 1816. During the infamous bank war that lasted from 1832 until the Great Depression that began in 1837, Biddle, the bank's president, fought Jackson with daring tenacity and vigor. So did members of Congress not under the sway of, quote, Old Hickory. Jackson cannily took to a friendly press, accusing Biddle of treason, while Biddle, equally shrewd, informed partisan journalists and editors that the president promoted anarchy and that his adherents were motivated solely by avarice and self-interest. Political cartoons from the era indicate how deeply partisan the issue of a central bank became. Here's a set to between Old Hickory and Bully Nick. Old Jack Mauser tearing apart the bank. This one I love, Banco's Ghost. I didn't include one that I thought was just too gory. It shows Andrew Jackson being roasted on a spit. So if you think that politics are difficult now, they were difficult then. But the man who battled Andrew Jackson had another clandestine career prior to his years as a financier. I was able to access newly discovered correspondence between Biddle and President James Monroe that reveal that Biddle was acting as Monroe's confidential agent during the years 1818 and 1819, which culminated in the Adams-Onis Treaty that redrew the nation's southern and western boundaries. And later, Monroe depended upon Biddle to secure votes from Pennsylvania to assure that the Missouri Compromise passed. I'm the first author to examine these documents, which now reside in the archives of Andalusia, Biddle's country estate. They are a treasure. Much of the correspondence was designated confidential. Biddle excised words and phrases, making the final versions, which are housed at the Library of Congress, politically prudent and innocuous. For example, one of the letters in Library of Congress, as per our recent communication, I plan to journey to Washington and confer with you. Obviously, that journey didn't entail a speedy round trip on the Acela. So what was Biddle intending to say? We know now because the originals are at Andalusia. It wasn't until I made the connection to the Adams and Onis Treaty that I understood the significance of Mr. O, or O as Biddle referred to him in his letters, who led a shadow Spanish legation based in Philadelphia and with whom Biddle had social contacts. I also found Biddle's 1804 to 1807 European journals at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. They had been believed lost, but were actually misfiled. I wept when I found them, and I had to leave the room because I didn't want to get tears on the documents, so I went out and snuffled in the hall. By happenstance, when I found those, I was rereading War and Peace, and I began to ponder Biddle's purpose for traversing Europe at the height of the Napoleonic Wars. The journals, however, are deceptively breezy, accounts of famous dinner companions, notable architecture, art that he admired, but no mention of battlefields or troop activity, which he must have seen when he traveled from France into occupied Austria. Not until he reached Greece and was, quote, safe from the noisy cannonades of Europe, did he mention the wars that were consuming the continent. In today's parlance, he had a perfect cover. He was journeying through Europe as a young man questing information. It wasn't the information that they had intended, however. Here he is as the young, looks like a young Byron, the romantic, poetic dandy who was traveling through Europe. Biddle's close relationship to Monroe dates from that period. Monroe was then minister plenipotentiary to Great Britain. Biddle served as his personal secretary, resulting in a lifelong friendship between the two men. Although Biddle was clearly at pains to impress his older mentor, those early letters are full of marvelously tortured phrases, lines excised, lines inserted. You can almost see the young man struggling, as you see, and his handwriting is fascinating. Whenever he was asking for a favor for Monroe, it begins to slope down. When he was pleased with himself, the writing slopes upward. Again, this is in Andalusia's archives, and no other scholar has yet seen these. But let me step back and provide some basic information. Born in 1786, Nicholas Biddle was a child prodigy. He graduated from what is now Princeton University at the age of 15, the youngest person to this day to do so. He was a classicist, an author, a polymath, as well as editing the journals of Lewis and Clark, which I detail in my book, but which deserves its own focus and talk. He edited the Portfolio, the preeminent literary compendium of the time, to which he also contributed. One of his uncles served in the First Continental Congress. His father fought in the Revolutionary War and was subsequently served as Vice President of Pennsylvania. The uncle for whom Nicholas was named died a hero during a 1778 naval engagement with a larger British vessel. The maternal side of Nicholas's family was no less prominent. He had been instilled with a sense of noblesse oblige since birth. And here is Biddle's family home, Andalusia. As you see, the quintessence of leisured existence. And a portrait by Sully of Jane Craig Biddle, who was very musical, retiring. She hated the spotlight. Biddle's fight with Jackson, in my view, was as much a clash of cultures as it was of ideology. In retrospect, their feud seems inevitable. Jackson, the rough-hewn frontiersman, determined to vanquish what he viewed as an effete elite aristocracy. And Biddle, the erudite scion of a cultured family. Biddle's hubris didn't help matters, but then neither did Jackson's. A letter that Biddle wrote Joseph Hopkinson in February 1834 reveals a single-mindedness and self-assurance verging on blindness. He could not imagine that a man of his intellect and breeding could possibly be wrong. I quote, "This worthy president thinks that because he has scalped Indians and imprisoned judges, he is to have his way with the bank. He is mistaken, and he may as well send at once and engage lodgings in Arabia," end quote. Biddle was wrong in that assessment, as we know. Public opinion grew ever more wrathful. Jackson was derided in the press as King Andrew, as you saw, and Biddle given the pseudonym of Old Snatch and Grab in George Lepard's Potboiler, the Quaker City. The halls of Congress were no less divided. In 1834, the Senate voted to censure Jackson over the bank issue. Missouri Senator Thomas Hart Benton, who had served as an aide to Jackson during the War of 1812, disagreed with the vote and brought loaded pistols into the Senate chamber. He and his opponent, Daniel Webster, and their supporters on both sides engaged in a day-long shouting match. Fortunately, no shots were fired. Senator David Crockett, who would die at the Alamo, compared Jackson to a, quote, dictator. "I do believe Santa Anna's kingdom will be a paradise compared with this in a few years," end quote. Tyrant, traitor, imperial despot became labels hurled by both sides. The Whigs referring to Jackson, the Democrats referring to Biddle. The newspapers relished the ongoing battle. Jackson narrowly escaped an assassination attempt. Thomas, one of Biddle's brothers, died of a duel defending his brother's honor. The fight spun out of control, with Jackson supporters insisting their man intended to run for a third term in order to, quote, save the country, end quote. If all of this sounds eerily familiar, well, it is. The term doom scrolling was unknown, of course, but just because the latest news didn't pop up on Twitter feeds or endless talk shows didn't mean the nation wasn't riveted to this battle. Newspapers like Polson's, printed here in Philadelphia, or Baltimore's Niles Register, both pro-Biddle, or the Washington Globe, pro-Jackson, devoted endless amounts of ink to the ongoing saga. Letters to the editor fumed and raged, with readers attacking one another in print. At the time, it must have seemed that the nation was about to implode. And reading those newspapers at the library company, the daily newspaper, going through every single article, it felt to me as if the nation then was about to implode. Even though I knew it had not, the sense of immediacy and urgency and horror consumed me. But the nation didn't implode, as we know. However, the bank war cast a pall across the entire country. The Panic of 1837 led to a financial depression that lasted into the mid-1840s. Biddle, Jackson, and Jackson's successor, Martin Van Buren, bore the brunt of the blame. Let me share part of the speech that Nicholas Biddle delivered in 1835, a year after the Second Bank of the United States was shuttered. Never desert the country. Never despond of its fortunes. Confront its betrayers. They will denounce you. Disregard their outcries. It cannot be that our free nation can long endure the vulgar dominion of ignorance and profligacy. You will live to see the laws reestablished. I'll conclude by saying that the bank war was only part of Nicholas Biddle's story. He was a dedicated family man, a voracious reader. Sitting in his library at Andalusia is a joy. He was a wit, a creator of really painful rhyming couplets that he was very proud of. They're terrible, however. He was a populist. He was a lover of the natural world. He was proud of his family. He was devoted to his country. And now I would be very happy to have questions.
Thank you, Cordelia. This is just really fascinating. And as you note, Jackson tends to get the primary focus. And so it's wonderful to hear about Nicholas Biddle. I invite anyone with questions to type them into the Q&A, and we will queue them up and have a great chance to ask questions. I want to start off, though, by asking you, how is it that you went to Andalusia and started doing research there, and no other scholar or researcher has yet done that?
Well, people have, but these letters are fairly new in the archives. They were in an attic that a Biddle descendant, also Nicholas, had them in a box in the attic, and he decided as an older man that it was time to give them to Andalusia. And Connie Houchins, the archivist there, did a wonderful job of intaking them and searching through them. So Govan, who wrote a seminal work on Biddle and banking, never had access to them. And as I mentioned, the letters in the Library of Congress are, unless you look at the dates, you would have no idea what Biddle and Monroe were discussing. It's only those draft forms of correspondence that they reveal everything, not just the bank, but really how Biddle became involved with the bank, which was because of Monroe. Monroe needed somebody. The second bank of the United States began to flounder after its inception in 1816. It was very poorly managed. And Monroe wanted, there again, used Biddle as a kind of covert person to enter into that. So he became a member of the board and then became its director.
Thank you. Nancy is wondering, is it possible to visit Andalusia?
Absolutely. I'm not sure what their policy is right now, but it has been open, and I think it will be open. It's very easy to find out, and it's wonderful. I'm not sure you can go to the archives, but just being in that house and seeing Biddle's library and his wife Jane's music stand and looking out at the Delaware, it really opened my soul to who Biddle was, because that was his dearest home.
Mm. And Susan wonders, did Biddle ever run for president? Or did he even ever consider running for president, I suppose?
Yes, he was a man wrote to him and said, you must do this. And I refer to that in the book because it's interesting. Biddle responded immediately to all of his correspondence, but he was delayed in responding to this. And my guess is that he was really pondering it. So he did not, however, but this gentleman kept pushing and saying, you should do this. The nation needs you. I think Jane would have hated it.
That's a big, so Carolyn says you say that that Biddle was a populist. I'm wondering if you could elaborate on what you mean by that.
Well, he believed that he was a populist. He believed that without banking, without a central bank, that the small traders, the people who relied upon putting seed in the ground, didn't have the ability to do that. And he also believed that creating canals and infrastructure in the nation helped move not only goods, but helped people connect with one another. So he felt that that would end partisan politics. It's very difficult to understand him as a populist because that's not what his background was, but that's what he thought of himself as. I mean, he thought that the bank was not really to put money in the hands of the wealthy, but to put money in the hands of what was then it wasn't referred to as a middle class, a working class. And that's who he thought would benefit. And those were the people that he was fighting for when he fought to have Alexander Hamilton's bank continue. Does that answer the question?
Hopefully. People don't get to raise their hand and say, I want to rephrase. Michael, I wondered, did Congress have a role in the fate of the second bank, or did Jackson act unilaterally?
Jackson had, this is really quite fascinating. Jackson had what was then called the kitchen cabinet, and they were all people who were vying with each other and trying to get Jackson's ear. yes, Jackson had supporters within Congress who were his adherents, vocally so. And then there were people on the other side who were very anti-Jackson. One thing I found fascinating was that one of Jackson's most vociferous aides, he was not on the cabinet, but he had Jackson's ear all the time, was one of Alexander Hamilton's sons, and he hated the central bank. I'm not a therapist, but that seems really odd. I just mention it in the book, but James Hamilton wrote a memoir, and he was very clear in that memoir how much he manipulated Jackson and how easy it was to manipulate him. It makes for pretty dicey reading.
Wow, interesting. I hope that's making everybody else want to dive into the book as much as it is me. Tabby says you mentioned that Nicholas's mother's family was also well-to-do, and wondering if you could share more about his mom.
Well, they were actually more. They were probably more well-to-do, or his mother's family, or his female ancestors were probably more elite than he. I would have to go back and look at. They came to Philadelphia originally, and the Biddles were in New Jersey as Quakers. The female side of his family was really interesting. They were Episcopalians, Anglicans and Episcopalians. And then the family came together, and Tabby, I will get all this information to you, I promise.
Wonderful. And Alvin is wondering if you saw hints in your research there of the Jackson and Biddle conflict. What hints did you see, if any, of the coming Civil War?
Oh, you can see that coming up very easily. The states' rights was a huge issue. South Carolina was a thorn in Jackson's side. He had to call out the militia. They wanted to secede from the Union even in the 1830s. So you can see that coming. You can see the tension between pro-slavery and abolitionist. And it's very clear. Obviously, this is all looking in hindsight, but it's very clear that fight, the fight that really began with Jackson and this partisan battle didn't go away. It subsided for a while, but it didn't disappear.
Mike wonders if Jackson ran for a third term, and if not, why?
He was really too ailing in spirit and psyche, and I think his supporters realized that this was not going to work, and there was a huge push to get somebody who was calm and would appeal broadly and try to end this partisan politics.
I want to jump a little into talking about Biddle as a banker and the central banks. There's a question here from Ken, wondering what it was in Nicholas's background that led him to become a financier.
Oh, very good question. Actually, nothing. And this I found really interesting. When he was at Princeton, his father constantly said, "Now, Nick, what about your finances? I really need an accounting of the money you're spending." And like me, his descendant, he couldn't balance his checkbook, and he was constantly overspending and had no idea what he was doing with money. He wanted to become an author. Oh, he had great hopes for being an artist, and then said, "No, I have to support myself." And as we know, authors don't always do that. So he became an attorney, And it was really only because he was so fascinated with Alexander Hamilton's bank and what banking could do for the common laborer that he became even interested in it. And then with the second Bank of the United States, when Monroe needed, again, to have somebody go and enter into that institution and report back to Monroe, who was then president, and say, this is what's going on. These are the bad people. These are the people who are stealing from the institution. This could be done better. That could be done better. It was only then that he said, oh, wait, I could do this myself. So he didn't enter into it as a financial wizard by any means. Now, this is not to say that I will ever, ever, ever be targeted to run a bank. It would be a disaster.
Of course, back then, you couldn't get your accounting degree or your MBA, or it's a very different time for the expectations. As you mentioned, he was a polymath, so he was well versed in so many different fields that he probably would have been able to take up just about anything.
Yes, yes.
So there's a number of questions here wanting to understand more about what a national bank did and how it compares to other banks. Stephen wants to know if you could say more about what it meant for a bank to be a national bank and what it did in this period. And also wondering, adjacent to that, did Britain or other European nations have national banks at that time?
That's interesting. That I'm not sure about. But Biddle's idea, and which is why it worked, was that there would be branch offices of the Second National Bank throughout the country, and that it was a matter of moving money around, so that not one bank didn't go under, that everybody was interdependent. And once Jackson killed that banking system, we did not have a central bank until the Federal Reserve in 1913. So it meant that, New York had a state bank and Pennsylvania had a state bank, and they were private banks. But Biddle's idea was that everybody should be interdependent. So if you were growing cotton in the South, or you were manufacturing that cotton into products in the North, you were borrowing money from a central bank, and the central bank controlled how the money flowed in and flowed out.
So Ken notes that the Bank of England preceded banks in the U.S. So thank you, Ken, for that update. And I guess then it would be, are you aware if Biddle was influenced at all by, say, the Bank of England, or if he really was looking to the first bank as his role model for how to run the second bank?
Well, he definitely was looking at the first bank as the role model, but having spent a few years in London, or almost 2 years in London, with as James Monroe's secretary, he had to have been aware of how the different politics and banking worked. He attended Parliament with Monroe. He really did understand the whole British system. So that would be my guess, but I'm not sure. I mean, he certainly made many comments when he came back on what was going on politically in England and Europe. When he came home, and I didn't mention this, I did say he had his sort of the perfect cover to be a confidential agent when he was in Europe, and coming back in 1807, and went immediately to meet with President Jefferson. He also, and this again was a gift to Andalusia, that's a recent gift, of a cipher. So my interpretation of that, cipher letters were very popular at the time. But my interpretation is that perhaps he was sending messages home that were in cipher and code. But he also could memorize anything. So he could have, in these journals, been writing about meeting Lord Elgin, who he referred to as a robber, but really it meant something else.
To continue on this, there's a question about the investors in the bank, wondering who they were. Did they include foreign investors, investors from England, for example?
They were mostly American investors. And there again, I think that had to do with this antipathy of going outside of the nation. Although Biddle had, he had connections with the Rothschilds, but if you consider how difficult it was to get letters of credit back and forth across the country, that was not very easy. It's not as it is now. But the investors that I found were all American.
So, and were there any differences in the activities between the Second Bank of the US and private banks?
Well, only in that the second bank had a much larger grasp, because they had banks in Georgia and Alabama and Massachusetts and Vermont, and so the reach was longer, and therefore they could lend more money, they could do more good, they could build, they could finance more infrastructure than a local bank.
And now we're going to kind of shift. We got some other questions about other aspects of Nicholas Biddle's life. Elizabeth has a question which ties right into the collections at the Athenaeum, about Biddle's interest in Greek architecture and how it sparked the development of the Greek revival style, and wondering if he saw this as a symbolic style that would lend significance to the second bank and other structures like Andalusia.
Well, when you read his journals of his traveling through Greece, well, he was a young man and he waxed rhapsodic at visiting Greece. And so I think that imbued his whole aesthetic sense, and then came home and saw that as how do we position ourselves as stable, powerful, respectable. And it was in that architecture that he saw a sort of a symbiotic connection with this ancient civilization.
Yeah, there's wonderful the stories of how he convinced Graz College, Graz to be built in the Greek revival and really go full sway, which
yes.
is really great. It's fun to think about what Philadelphia might look like if it hadn't been for Nicholas Biddle, and how much we've benefited.
Well, just walking by the second bank, it's beautiful, and I often think of what it looked like when it was being constructed with all the marble and it's glorious, and it rises in such a different way than the brick buildings surrounding it. It soars. It's sort of a temple to glory as well as finance.
Elizabeth says that there are some letters at pen now from Constance Biddle that are about Thomas Biddle in England trying to raise funds for the bank, and maybe in France also. And she doesn't know if he was successful in his efforts.
He was not successful. I think by then everything had just fallen apart, and the bank had become so unpopular and it was under such duress. So no.
So there is another question. Eileen is wondering, what did Biddle do after he lost that battle for the second bank? What did he do with the rest of his life?
He retreated to Andalusia. He was broken in spirit and health. it's really tragic to read his final days of him wandering around Andalusia. He didn't see any of his former friends. He felt so wounded. And I found the scrapbook that he was working on when he died. And I don't think anyone had opened it since his grandson, Edward Biddle, had put it into wrapping paper and stowed it away. And you can see Biddle's attention wandering. You can see where his attention, what he wanted to keep as his epitaph, what he glued onto the pages, what he didn't glue onto the pages. And then the book ends without finishing it. It's just, when I found it, I was so moved.
And interesting, some of those personal types of things that just, as you say, what people add and what they leave out can tell you so much about someone's state of mind. So we can tell it's Women's History Month because there are questions about the women in Biddle's life. There's a question about his wife, Jane Craig. What was her role in her life? What were her own personal or professional interests that she followed?
Jane was a real homebody. She hated all the hoopla and the entertaining that Biddle thrived upon. Her mother had been very vivacious, probably a charming woman, but probably a difficult mother because I think she didn't feel that Jane's sense of style measured up to her own, which made Jane even more reclusive. She adored her family. She adored Andalusia, which had actually been her family home before she married Nicholas. That was where she was happiest. She loved music. As I said, her music stand is still at Andalusia. She tried so hard to drag Biddle away from the bank and from public duties. She went through a feeling of terrible despair after one of her children died. And they traveled, went down south to some hot springs until she got better. But she was really at heart a loving mom and homebody. And I think this role that she was thrust into was something that she was very uncomfortable with. Which is not to say that she should have been comfortable with it. It's just not who she was. And you could see in everything she did how happy she was at Andalusia. She just, it was a nurturing place for her.
Inquiring minds want to know, where do you fall in the family tree in relation to Nicholas Biddle? What's
direct descendant. I'm not sure how many grades. I should know that. But that means counting, which I'm just not good at. I can't balance a checkbook. I can't count. So direct descendant. And I actually started writing this. I got fascinated with the whole idea of the story. I was asked to attend a dinner for the Federal Reserve years ago, and someone sitting next to me said, "Oh, you're descendant of Nicholas Biddle. You should write about Nicholas Biddle." And I said, "Well, I don't know anything about banking." And he said, "Oh, you can learn." And then I get so fascinated with Biddle's character, Jackson's character, Calhoun, Webster, all the people that wove themselves in and out of Biddle's life and Biddle's ancestors, and who they were and what their place in American history was.
That is really fascinating. And I think you answered another question about how your position as a descendant of the Biddle family informed your research.
It absolutely did. I walk by Nicholas Biddle's grave, which is at St. Peter's Church at 313 Pine, 3rd and Pine, every day and say hello. Strangely enough, somebody's throwing pennies onto the grave. I don't know how those come to be, but it seems an omen, I guess. But I sit there and talk to him and say, you will live to see the laws reestablished.
Please.
Please.
Albert's curious if he maintained a Philadelphia address, and if so, does that house still exist?
Yes, it does. It is at 8th and Spruce, and it's just been renovated. A youngish couple purchased it, and it's gorgeous. It's got a double entry. It's huge, and it's got a plaque out in front of it, so you can't miss it. It's right near the hospital. But they found when they purchased it that the prior owner had lowered the ceilings, but the ceilings, they took all that lowered ceiling out and found that the original molding was still there. So they've taken it back to its glory. And Biddle loved to entertain. He entertained all of the time. He entertained Joseph Bonaparte, which I talk about in the book, and he was entertained by Joseph Bonaparte at Bonaparte's estate and in the city. He was really a social animal. As I said, Jane was not, but he was. That was his lifeblood, was seeing people, entertaining, being entertained, having conversations.
Well, we have time for these last three questions, and one I think that may help respond. What you just said may help give an answer idea to this question. Any ideas to why Nicholas Biddle was so prudent and responsible as a central banker, and yet such a reckless speculator in his personal finances?
None whatsoever, except that it might have gone back to his sense of duty, that he felt responsible to the nation, that this was really almost inherent in him, inherited from his ancestors. Whereas in his own life, he was kind of the artist who didn't care, loved to throw lavish parties. But the bank was a different thing. The bank was national. The bank was his responsibility. The bank needed to reflect all the good that was in the nation.
Well, so, and Victoria is curious about what you found most surprising in your research.
Oh, that's great. Well, I think the fact that that when he traveled to Europe, which I'd known that he'd done that, but I didn't understand the extent of his travels, nor did I understand that there was an ulterior motive to it. And it wasn't until finding that cipher letter, and as I said, by happenstance, rereading War and Peace. And you can't read War and Peace without saying, why is this young man traveling through Switzerland into occupied Austria? What is he expecting? The whole continent was falling apart. It was, villages and towns were pockmarked with cannon shells. There were troop movements everywhere. And that's when I thought, that was the big surprise to me. What was he doing there? Why was he there? But as I said, he had this perfect cover, a young man seeking erudition, looking at the capitals of Europe, meeting interesting people, attending wonderful dinner parties. That was who he seemed to be and who he was, but he had an ulterior motive.
Well, this leads our final question, actually, is the rabbit hole that I opened when I introduced you at the beginning. But there have been several questions here. Curious about why the archives of St. Catherine Drexel are being destroyed. Do you want to briefly?
Oh, well, they were taken, the mother house was sold. And so the archives were taken to what was remain of the archives were taken to the archdiocese. The archdiocese didn't have room for all the archives. And so letters between Catherine Drexel and her sisters, nuns, were shredded. They kept all of the material that related to her canonization, but the letters between the sisters themselves, all the letters that referred to the work at Xavier University or the far-flung missions, most of that is gone, and it can never be. And so I look at that and say, yes, but I referred to all of that in my endnotes, and now those are gone. So no scholar can ever access that again. It just is, it's tragic.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. And that points to us, the importance of digging in attics and finding things, and also protecting those records that are important for telling our greater story. Tess is putting up as we thank Cordelia for just a wonderful, enlightening, and wonderfully provided talk about Nicholas Biddle and the bank war. And we look forward to reading your book, and are so glad for this time. Look forward to being able to share some deviled eggs together at a reception in the future when we're able to do so. And in the meantime, there are still things that you can do with the Athenaeum.